Yeah, my name is Frida Nagel. I work as a composer and music producer, and I focus on the intersection between acoustic and electronic music. In the past, it was more like classical music and electronic music, and now I'm going more into the kind of pure electronic, techno, abstract, experimental kind of music.
Okay.
Yeah,
And I know that you also write for orchestras and dance and theater too.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, last year I was working on a ballet, and I'm doing music for documentaries or for radio shows and all kinds of soundtracks. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thanks. Mathieu, you are well known as a visual artist. You develop a lot of immersive multimedia environment and interactive pieces.
Yeah, yeah, I've been like working in this field for the last maybe 10, 15 years now, and spent a lot of time in Montreal where I started to work for this big company called Moment Factory. And then I also like started to continue to work on my own project and started to do audiovisual performances and collaborating with musicians. And I show my work at Mutex Festival and also Sonar. And then afterwards, I started to make also installations and also immersive experiences. I mean, I can I like to change like the media I use. Sometimes it can be like purely like digital artwork, and sometimes it can be also analog. So I like also combining different media together, like light, visual, sound, to create this kind of new languages and new way to tell stories.
The piece you present for Multiplica is called The Arrival. It's an audiovisual live experience based on a collaboration between you two. And could you describe it, Frida, this piece, The Arrival?
Yeah. Yeah, so the whole idea of the work came from last year, where there was no stage and no audience. So I was working on an audio visual installation inside of a park. So we planted speakers and lights in on the top of a tree, and when it took the night came and people were crossing at that certain space, they were kind of crossing the park to make their way show their way shorter back to home after work. And we surprised them with that tree that sprung to life automatically when they passed by. So there was little music coming up, and they were like, okay, where's the music coming from? Then they see lights inside of the tree, and they stopped by and listened, and some people got really overwhelmed by it. I've seen people cry. There were people like, or teenagers stopping their boombox and listening, or people dancing and kissing. It was really amazing to kind of join them and see how they react. And it was really a good project to kind of try different things now that we are in this special situation, and kind of use it as something positive and something proactive to create another space or another way to present music. And this is where like kind of the first sketches for The Arrival um, began to form themselves. And yeah, and with the questions you play at Multiplica Festival, I was really curious to bring that on stage. This idea of um, how do you say, normally I perform on stage like really traditional. I'm there and I'm playing music with my instruments, and that's it. It's on a jazz festival or on a classical festival, and I'm always that guy, the strange guy who's doing also electronics. And now I wanted to take this approach and this experience of making really like pure abstract electronic music and put that on stage, and it's really new for me. And so the title The Arrival is also a little bit coming from that idea to do something new, to create something new. And I'm really happy to work with Mautic, who's I know his work for many years, since he worked with Max Cooper and with my label mate Cubings. And I immediately thought about his work and that it would be cool to do something together based on that work.
Okay, I heard also that the Arrival is also inspired by another pieces realizing during the pandemic, Sonido Blanco. Could you explain the link between the two pieces?
So Nido Blanco is the original name for this audio installation in the park. So the idea was to, because in that place you have the sounds of the surroundings, you have the cars passing the park, you have the sounds of the nature in the park, and you have this kind of tension between the people living in the city and have to relax for like 5 minutes. You know, they go inside the park and they give themselves like a quick dose of nature, like they give like having a sandwich in the tube or something like that. And that's really like the tension that the city is still all the time like growing and evolving and everything, and then you have this little space of like nature and birds and trees and everything. And I was looking for music that supports this feeling, that is a little bit of this tension, that something's about to happen. There's some insecureness, there's you're expecting something, but on the other side you're really trying to let everything go and to relax and be in the moment, but you don't have much time. And for me now, I'm living since 1.5 years now completely in the forest. So there's like 50 people here living with me in that place, and it's a huge change from Berlin to that countryside. And for me, going back into the city, into this little space of doing the audio installation Sonido Blanco in the little park, it was for me like reflecting on my life in the city. And yeah, Sonido Blanco is all about kind of creating frequencies to reflect on these thoughts. Yeah.
Mathieu, how do you heard about Frieder? Do you know his work before?
No, I didn't know his work before he get in touch with me, and he told me that he was under the same label that Cubanks, so another musician I used to work with, Infini, and I'm always curious about Infini, like a group of artists they choose is also very always like uncommon and very interesting musically, mixing classical and electronic music together. So he asked me, like, they had this festival, like, in Multiplica, and so I wanted to participate. So I listened to his music, and I actually really like his universe, like mixing, like, piano, synthesizer, like classical music and electronic music together. When I work with musicians, actually, like, it's very difficult to sometimes to follow the music and to make something that also match with their thoughts. It can be like very easy, or it can be also very difficult. It depends on the choice of both artists. But in my case, what I do, I create a system with with a similar aesthetic, but actually I build an architecture, and then I analyze the sound in different ways. So when we're gonna work with Frieder, we're gonna analyze like 3 different like soundtracks separately, and those 3 separate soundtracks where the frequency will be analyzed in real time will affect different parts of the image. So it can be the colors, it can be the animation, it can be the camera movement. So at the same time, it gives like a lot of openness to improvisation for him, but at the same time for me, because I can also like, come into the system and change some modulation. So there is one part which is completely generated from the sound, which I can't really control, and one other part where I can also decide through the time. So like most of the time, the aesthetic remains the same during 40 minutes with a different like iteration and movement. And I like creating something that is kind of pure and doesn't change from one scene to the other with completely different. And I like creating also a tool of improvisation for myself, and not just activating videos or things that most VJ does usually.
Okay, thanks. And when do you decide to work together? Because the Arrival, it's a totally new project.
Yeah, it will be a premiere at the festival.
Yeah.
And it will be our first time working together and also presenting the music live for the first time on stage. Yeah.
Yeah. And a question about the pandemic, obviously. Is the melancholic mood of the arrival influenced by the actual pandemic situation?
Yeah, totally. So the idea was to kind of have something proactive, something positive, but still the melancholy is always there when you work alone in your little room and thinking about the world outside. I think it's it's natural, but I think there's also a melancholic side of in the music that could be really like positive and to where you can gain strength out of the melancholic thing. So I try to express this. Yeah.
And is the collaboration with Mautic a discovery for you? Are you already work on, for example, algorithmic music or interactive pieces?
No, there were years ago I worked with Tobias Sauer, who's a digital artist from Hamburg, and we were making an experimental installation. But it's the first time actually. Actually, it's kind of a how do you say? Every time I do a new project, it's always a pain in the ass creatively because it's always something new. The first time I was on stage was with a symphonic orchestra, and I haven't any experience of writing score. So it was really heavy. And then I moved on working with smaller ensembles with brass and woodwinds, and I had no experience with that. And then I was starting to play in clubs really far away from my origins as more like an improvised based jazz musician. And yeah, now I did this audio installation in outside and for the first time, and now I'm working with Mathieu, and it's really great. I'm really looking forward. It's super cool. To every project is new, but in the same place there's so much things to learn about and to see how it will work out. So yeah.
Okay. And Mathieu, how do you describe your visual on the arrival?
Well, it's pretty new now. I'm still working on it, and we'll see the results. But yeah, for me, it's always good to start new project in collaboration. Like it's less heavy than doing a project alone somehow. And I feel like always very inspired by music most of the time. So I create things a bit intuitively, and I explain a bit of to Frieder how I work a little bit, and I'm very inspired by nature, landscapes, and all this kind of organic movement. I use like digital tools, but at the end, my result looks much more like analog than digital. So I like also like combining this kind of both aspects together, the animation, the camera, the 3D, but at the end, it looks very like textural and very like noisy analog. So what I do most of the time is just I use a lot of random like data, how I control like the information I receive from the sound. So if I receive a beat or if I receive a frequency, I always add some randomness to those signals so they don't behave the same way all the time. So at the end, I'm also surprised the way my system reacts, and it becomes like this kind of audiovisual sculpture that is shaped with the sound through the time, and becomes very like a meditative and very you give a human feeling to the technology somehow.
And a question for both of you: how do you manage the tension between nature and digital media electronics?
I think like for the music, Frieder does. For me, like the piano, the synthesizer would be more the nature, and then the other layer would be the technology somehow. So for me, it's like two different narratives that sometimes mix to each other and sometimes just get separate. So following this like narrative or composition with the time, actually will just make them like interact together somehow. And so there will be one a layer that will be pre-composed, and one layer that will be completely like improvised. So I can assign like this notion of nature and technology through those layers and mix them together.
And you, Frieder, do you want to add something about
Yeah,
this?
I love the to play with the perceptions. So if you think on digital art, you think really on something cold, digital, unhuman, automatic. And when you think about analog music, it's something warm and everything. And to put like pure electronic music inside the top of a tree and make it sound really organic and acoustic, that's what I love to do. And if people can't distinguish between the sounds, so I take an acoustic instrument, I record it, and I transform it to something really abstract and digital. The same place I play a synthesizer, and it almost sounds like a violin or something, and you can't really like distinguish between the two, and it really merges into together. And there's where I think something really new starts, where you don't really like, it's not about mixing genres or doing crossover, whatever. I think this is something of the past. I think the future of this kind of projects is to really let these categories behind and create something new out of it on the basis on all the experience that we had in the last decades and years about this projects. And I'm really curious about that, and trying to mix the sounds in a way where this categories doesn't matter even anymore.
And in a more general way, what is your general feeling about our relationship with nature today? For example, as an artist, are you concerned by the global warming, for example? Are you, as some people today, affected by eco-anxiety?
Yeah, I mean, in my case, I created the last piece last September called Erratic Weather, and it's actually like audiovisual performance that take data from different hurricanes that happen in the world, and it takes like how the hurricane was created and what was the data at that moment, and until like the way it disappears. So we take like all those data like on a timeline, and for each performance we use this kind of data visualization to create the contents. And the idea is to recreate this kind of hurricane feeling with a 4D sound system and a surrounded video. So I'm for sure we really like. I mean, in my case, I'm really concerned with the nature, and with this pandemic time. Like I live in Berlin, but there's not much things happening, and I miss more and more like the nature and the countryside. Also, I grew up in the countryside, so by the sea. So I sometimes don't see the point to live in a city anymore, and I actually envy Frieder to live in the forest.
Frieder, do you want to add something about this question of concern?
So I was living in Berlin, thinking about myself, like going to the bio supermarket and being the eco guy, you know. But when I moved back to the countryside after so many years, I really realized that my synapses and my senses are so trained into this urban kind of way of life. So I had so many encounters with nature and with animals and with insects and stuff here that I wasn't used to it, and I didn't even realize it. And now I have a little son of 2 years, and he's like all about this kind of, he sees only this, you know, and I'm really inside of my head. And I was really surprised about this. And then when I was working on The Arrival and on Cindy Blanco, I was trying to give a little bit of wonder back to this tree, because it's 300 years old. It's standing there. It has seen so many things in this park and in this place, and to really make us wonder and question about nature again without trying to answer it, and just let it be and just let us astonish about it, but not in a spiritual way and in a thing that it has some sort of argument or reason, just because it exists and it's a wonder, and that's it, and enjoy it and kind of experience it. And it's really difficult to do if our minds are stuck in this digital laptop kind of urban world, which is super great, and I'm a digital native, but yeah, you forget about these things. And I think that's the ground, the main reason of our problem with the nature, with our relationship, that we lost somehow the contact, and not trying to going back. But a walk won't do it. Just a walk in the park or open the window, this won't do it. It really has to change our perception of the nature, I think.
Yeah. And do you think these feelings appears in the arrival? Do you think the audience will experience this sensation, this feeling?
Yeah, I hope so. What is so great about the work of Mathieu is that he creates a space where you can lose yourself and where you can experience not a visual show in the traditional sense of watching something, but it's more like losing yourself in the visuals, and it's really similar to what you can experience if you watch the sea or if you watch a sunset, but in a digital or in an urban kind of context. So I think this is an approach that really appeals to his work, and I'm really looking forward to create music inside of this surrounding of him. Yeah.
You want to add something, Mathieu?
No, thank you. That's a very good description of my work somehow, and I also look forward to this new collaboration. It's also like, yeah, I think my work is very meditative because, like as I said before, using this randomness data like make this thing almost like a synthetic life appearing. So yeah, you can lose yourself into that as two images are maybe can't be repetitive, and I'm very obsessed with this kind of that feeling to be able to change some parameters all the time, so it becomes like always like growing or evolving, and like some kind of I don't know, living organism, but adapt itself to the surroundings somehow.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think one thought. I think when I look at stuff, I always want to value. I want to have an opinion. I want to judge really quick. So this is kind of how we survive in our multi-optional lives. And I think when you look at the visual work of Mathieu, you can't do this because it's abstract. But in the same way, it's not abstract in the traditional way of doing a counterpoint to everything what is harmonic. So it's not about being against or being super experimental that you can't understand anything, so you have things to suggest and stuff that you feel, but you can't really judge and talk about them immediately. And I think that's really cool to go away from that attitude, speaking about myself, to really like look at something and immediately have an opinion about it. Yeah.